I'm Neil, and I'm the teacher.
And I'm Sean, and I'm the deal maker.
Together, we're the Rise Guys.
The lease expired. The tenant did not leave. And under the law, the landlord may have no fast way to remove them. Today, I walk you through every type of tenancy, which one creates this trap, and what the law says about it. Let me open with a scenario that trips up people entering property management. A fixed term lease reaches its end date. The tenant does not move out. They do not sign a new lease. They simply stay. The landlord assumes they can go to the door, ask the tenant to leave, and that will be the end of it. Here's where it gets complicated. The situation has a legal name: tenancy at sufferance, also called a holdover. The tenant is technically there without the landlord's permission, but they are also still physically in the property. What happens next depends heavily on which province you are in, because the legislation varies. In British Columbia, the law tends to lean toward protecting the tenant. In Alberta, it leans more toward the landlord. Same scenario, two very different outcomes. This is why understanding tenancy types before you draft a lease is not optional. It is how you protect your client from day one. There are 4 recognized types of tenancy, and they all behave differently when it comes time to end the relationship. The first 2 are the formal types. Fixed term tenancy has a defined start date and a defined end date written into the agreement. The tenancy does not automatically renew when that date arrives. These leases are common in both residential and commercial spaces because they give the landlord predictable, stabilized income for a defined window. Periodic tenancy works differently. It automatically renews at the end of each term for a new term of the same duration. The most common version is month to month. A periodic tenancy does not end on a date. It ends when one party gives the other the required statutory notice. In Alberta specifically, a tenant typically provides 30 days. A landlord may be required to give 90. That asymmetry often surprises people who are new to property management. Third type is tenancy at will. This one arises by implication. Neither party signed a formal lease, but both behaved as though one existed. A common example is a buyer who takes early possession of a property before the sale officially closes. There is no signed agreement, but they are in the property and both sides understand the arrangement. Tenancy at will is informal, but the landlord still has real obligations. They must ensure the property has heat, light, and power, and both parties must still adhere to the property's permitted use. And the fourth type is the one we opened with: tenancy at sufferance, the holdover. The fixed term expired, the tenant stayed, no new agreement was signed, and no permission was given. The tenant is there without legal authority, but they are there. This is the most legally volatile of the 4, because what the landlord can actually do next depends on the province and what the legislation says. Now let us talk about what makes a lease actually hold up when you need it to. There are 7 elements required for a lease to be legally enforceable. First, the full legal names of all parties on the agreement. Second, the signatures of those parties. Third, a description of the premises that is specific enough that there is no ambiguity about what property is covered. Fourth, consideration, which in almost every residential lease means rent. Fifth, a legal and permitted use for the space. A lease for an activity that violates the law is not enforceable. Sixth, the term dates, both the start and the end. And seventh, defined covenants, the specific obligations of both the landlord and the tenant. Each of these 7 is load bearing. Drop one from your agreement and you may find your lease cannot protect you when the holdover tenant refuses to leave and you need the document to stand up. There is one more distinction every property manager has to carry at all times. Residential leases and commercial leases are not governed the same way. Residential leases sit under statute law. In Alberta, that is the Residential Tenancy Act. The legislation prescribes what you can and cannot do as a landlord. Landlord access requires a minimum of 24 hours notice in most residential situations. You do not negotiate that in the lease. It is the law. Commercial leases operate under common law and negotiated contracts. The parties have far more latitude, access rules, rent structures, what happens to tenant improvements when the lease ends. These are all items that get negotiated. The rule of thumb is this: residential law protects the person living there. Commercial law enables the business operating there. Know which world you are in before you draft a single clause, because getting that wrong means advising a client with the wrong framework. Let me leave you with the practical takeaway. In almost every holdover situation, what you are really looking at is a drafting failure that happened months or years before the crisis. The lease did not clearly define what happens when the term ends and the tenant does not leave. The renewal provisions were vague. The covenants were light. And when the end date arrived, the landlord had fewer tools than they thought. Here is how you prevent it. First, run through all 7 required elements before any lease is signed. One missing element is all it takes to compromise your whole agreement. Second, include explicit language around renewal and holdover consequences. Make the terms clear before anyone signs, not after the problem starts. And third, know your provincial legislation. The outcome for a landlord dealing with a holdover in Alberta is not the same as in British Columbia, and your advice needs to reflect that difference. Get the lease right on day one. That is when you have the most power. That is the show for this week. I will see you in the next one. New webinar summary every week. Subscribe so you never miss one.